Hi, everybody. Welcome to week 4. This is going to be a bit shorter than normal, partially because the material is very heavy, and partially because the material is very timely. And for both of those reasons, I didn't want to overdo it because A, it's something that we're all living through right now, various extents and in various capacities, depending on our own positions, right? But also because it's so close to home for so many people, because this is the week that we'll be talking about immigration. So let's get into it. Yeah, it's going to be heavy. I'll keep it concise. Take space if you need. We're going to talk about borders and migration. So Butler's discussion of borders, migration, and in particular border policing gets at two really significant aspects of the history and present of U.S. approaches to the southern border. Just moved up north. In particular, it's moved back to its location prior to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which is how the U.S. got control over California, among other states. So the California-Oregon border used to be the U.S.-Mexico border. So Butler on borders. She doesn't really talk a lot in terms of like the focus of the narrative on borders, but there's this underlying theme, right? Which is that one thing that the characters have to contend with as they try to make their way and make lives for themselves in this world is that there might be more jobs up north, but there's also this massive threat of the policing of the border. And whether they have to reckon with whether or not it's worth it to make that journey. And so here are a couple of quotes exemplifying that. We've got, and what if they wanted to go north, try for a better life in Oregon or Washington or Canada? It would be much harder to travel with a baby or two and much more dangerous to try to sneak past hostile guards and over state lines or international borders with babies. This is just Lauren's inner monologue. I accidentally put a third quote there. Then we've got, I talked to this guy. He said he was going to Alaska. Good luck to him, I said. He's got a lot of guns to face before he gets there. He won't get there. Alaska must be 1,000 miles from here. I nodded. More than that, and with hostile state lines and borders along the way. This is when Keith came back to Robledo after he left, and they're talking about a guy he met on the road. And then farther north, we can get work, maybe, but people have been flooding north for years. Jobs are scarce up there too, and state lines and borders are closed. This is from Curtis and Lauren sort of like plotting what they could do to make a life for themselves as the violence is ramping up in Robledo, but before the border, before the fire. Sorry, my phone rang and I'm trying to silence it because we don't need that happening while we're in lecture. Okay. So, a brief history of the U.S.-Mexico border. Obviously, it does not start where this timeline starts, right? In that this region has a much longer history, and Spain colonized Mexico in the 1600s. So, like, the history of empire and borders and land and territory disputes in this region dates to the beginning of colonialism. It does not date to the beginning of Mexico as a country. But our topic for today is in particular the U.S.'s relationship to its own southern border, specifically the border with Mexico, because it was a lot, when that area was controlled by Spain, there was a lot less U.S. concern about that region because the U.S. was much more focused on expanding westward and the threat to westward expansion posed by indigenous resistance. And it was a lot less concerned with the southern border as a political, economic, or racial threat. And so for the context of this lecture, we're going to be focusing on things post the establishment of Mexico as a state. So with that out of the way, here are some important dates and a brief history of the border since the establishment of Mexico. So in 1820, and for that earlier history, Gloria Anzaldúa writes some about that in the essay I assigned for today on Aztlán. And if you want more about that history, I can recommend some really excellent books on indigenous regional histories of the Southwest. We talked a bit about it, right, 2 weeks ago when we talked about the colonization of the Southwest, and then the Pueblo Revolt and the Reconquista. So we covered that a bit, but yeah. 1821, Mexico declares independence from Spain, and in this era of the like early mid 1800s, we've got a lot of migration north south. So people coming from the U.S. to Mexico, and sometimes bringing violence and chasing Mexican, especially in Texas, so Tejano people off of their lands and claiming them. In 1830, Mexico abolishes enslavement, and the settlers who have moved down to Texas want to keep having slaves, so they secede from Mexico, which Mexico sees as a huge threat to its territory, because Texas is a large chunk of territory. Especially, and this escalates further when Texas petitions to join the U.S. as a slaveholding state in 1845. And this is after, right, the 10-year gap here is filled with fighting between Texas and Mexico over who gets to control Texas, right? Texas doesn't just secede from Mexico. It fights and then declares its independence. And we have this whole history of battles, including the Alamo, that Anzaldúa gets into a little bit. So 1845, Texas petitions to join the U.S. as a slaveholding state. Mexico sees this as U.S. encroachment on its territory and declares war. So then the U.S. declares war in response and then invades Mexico, far beyond just Texas, invades all the way to Mexico City. So the war ends because of the invasion of Mexico City. And the U.S. forces Mexico to sign something called the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which cedes the territory that we now know as Arizona, California, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado, as well as some parts of Wyoming, Kansas, and Oklahoma to U.S. This is the region known as Aztlan. And this was all of those states, except the little, not the entirety of Wyoming, Kansas, or Oklahoma, but the entirety of those other states, except the southern region, the southernmost region of Arizona and New Mexico, was purchased separately a couple of years later in something called the Gadsden Purchase, where the U.S. wanted to build a southern railroad and needed more territory for it, and so they bought more territory from Mexico. And this 1853, with this Gadsden Purchase, this is how we get the border that we recognize today. So this is when the border that we know today becomes the border. And this purchase and this whole kind of like establishment of the border is kind of arbitrary. And because of that, what ends up happening is some indigenous communities that live along the border have half of their reservation lands on the U.S. side and half on the Mexican side. We have the same phenomenon up on the northern border too, with like the Haudenosaunee territory in particular. But in the south, it's the Tohono O'odham territory that is split in this way. So anyway, this is 1853 is when we get the border that we recognize today. But it's not really working the same, and it's not really framed the same in the public consciousness as it is today. This was a very porous border. There was not nearly as much tracking or limitation on migration, and it was, as I said, mostly white settlers moving south. This starts to change in the 1900s, though. So throughout the early 1900s, we got this massive paranoia about an economic and racial threat posed by migrants from other places, especially people not recognized as white in this period. So people from Asia, especially people from Africa, but then also people that we now think of as white, but who weren't seen as white in this era. So like Jews and Irish people, Italian people. There were there were like, not quotas yet. There was a lot of paranoia and concern about this. So in 1907, the U.S. makes something called a gentleman's agreement with Japan, where the U.S. says we're not going to ban Japanese migration as long as Japan blocks people from leaving for the U.S. But the U.S. really relied on Japanese laborers, so this created this labor shortage. And the US was like, okay, great, we'll recruit Mexican migrants to fill the roles. So there becomes this shift from a primarily southern migration into Mexico to this northern migration out of Mexico to fill these jobs. And so in the 1910s, the rest of the country isn't too concerned with Mexican migrants as a threat because they're filling these jobs that nobody else was filling. So they're good for the economy. But in the borderlands, so like Texas and like the Southwest, the tensions are pretty high. And there is a fair amount of racist vigilante violence that Ansel Dua talks about, right? These there's informal armed groups of civilians, and then there's more formal militias like the Texas Rangers that are policing Mexican people for perceived criminality, but a lot of the perceived criminality has a lot to do with like the same kinds of racist stereotypes that lead people to decide somebody is a criminal simply for existing that we talked about last week with like racism and stereotyping. So in 1920, in the 1920s, we get these quotas that are established to limit the number of migrants from places that the US doesn't want migrants from. Limited numbers, and it's by place, it's also by race. So we get quotas on particular European racial categories from migrating. And we also get bans on people from certain regions coming into the country. And this has to do with racial fears of people who are thought of as a threat, both because there's this fear that they'll take jobs and because there's this fear that migrants will in some way pollute the racial purity of white people in the US. This is the eugenics era that we talked about last week. Right, the 1920s to the 1940s was like peak eugenics era. And this is when we saw a lot of eugenics happening, say, in Nazi Germany, for instance. But we also saw it happening in the US and all over. And so then in 1929, we get the great. Oh, but importantly, there were no quotas in the Western Hemisphere. So this did not put a damper on how many people could come up from Mexico or Canada into the U.S. and vice versa. It was just for banning people from other places and limiting numbers from other places, particularly Europe, in terms of the quota numbers, whereas the bans were primarily for like Africa and Asia. So in 1924. The Border Patrol is founded, but it's primarily used to stop European migrants from sneaking in across land borders in hopes of avoiding quotas. And this is because, right, racial tension between people in the borderlands and violence against Chicano people is already happening on the individual, like, armed civilian, local militia, and Texas Ranger stage. So the Border Patrol isn't really needed for that in this time. It's focused on, and its goal was stopping European migrants from sneaking around quotas. Then 1929, this changes because the Great Depression hits, and now U.S. workers are desperate for employment and they want all the jobs, including jobs previously deemed inferior for them that they were like, oh, I don't want to do that. Like particularly physical or demeaning labor. And also, everybody who can be in the workforce needs to be in the workforce in order to survive, because people with multiple wage earners in their families are still starving in the Depression. So now Mexican migrants are framed as a massive source of competition for jobs. So Border Patrol starts deporting Mexican migrants. From 1929 to 1937, there is a massive deportation campaign. 458,000 people are deported. And much like today, the majority of these are legal residents, not undocumented migrants. These are people who have their visas. And in being deported like this, they were often denied their legal rights to fair trial and representation, and a justification for why they were being deported and why their legal residency status was being ignored. There were also a lot of children who were born in the US and therefore citizens by birth, because at this point we have birthright citizenship, who were being deported, which is unconstitutional. And similarly, there were naturalized citizens being deported, also unconstitutional. This effectively ended migration north for a while. Not undocumented migration, but in general, like undocumented and documented migration both pivot in this time period. Until the 1940s, when World War II is in full swing and the majority of the workforce is gone to the military. So we've got this like massive kind of like multi-pronged campaign to get more people into the workforce, right? We've got Rosie the Riveter and that sort of like women in the workplace movement, but we've also got a massive need for particularly agricultural laborers to fill this void. So we have a return to migration from Mexico to the US and the creation of something called the Bracero program, which was a government-run temporary worker program specifically for the agricultural industry. Bracero is Spanish for arm, and the idea was to recruit young men in particular from Mexico to come to the US temporarily to do agricultural industry on a seasonal basis and then go back to Mexico to spend their money in the Mexican economy. And the idea is it would bolster both economies, fill the US, fill jobs that needed filling in the US for the agricultural industry's sake, and be like mutually beneficial. It was supposed to only be a wartime policy program, but labor shortages continued, so the program was initially extended to 1949. But there was more of a demand for workers than there were Bracero program participants. So companies started soliciting people directly and sort of bypassing the formal program and documentation entirely. And so we started seeing an uptick in undocumented migrants coming to do agricultural labor. And with this, we started to see an uptick also in anxiety around illegal, quote unquote, immigrants. Why I put that in quotes is because calling somebody an illegal immigrant is like saying that their presence is itself illegal. It's like it's something called a status crime, right? It's the idea that somebody's existence in a place at a time is itself criminal, and that's not fair. That's pretty cruel. So that's why I'm putting that in quotes. Anyway, people are very afraid that people are coming in without documentation and calling people illegal. And this is where we sort of start to see this fear of the illegal alien become increasingly popular. And so because of this, the US expands the Bracero program again. But there's still not enough workers, and so companies continue soliciting people directly, and there's still more anxiety around this rising number of undocumented migrants and this concern over the threat posed by the illegal alien. Rinse and repeat up until 1954. In 1953, we get a recession, plus the return of veterans from the Korean War who need work. And so once again, we see this shift in the job market, this economic downturn, and desperation for more jobs in the US population, which leads to people seeing Mexican migrants as more of a threat and more competition. So the racism rears its head, the competition for jobs becomes like a justification for racist outcry. And then there's the specter of the illegal immigrant worker that kind of like all of this coalesces in the US consciousness and becomes like the source of public outrage, which leads to increasing militarization of the border, increasing policing of the border, and increasing deportations. And so we get this operation. I'm not going to say the name because that's a slur, but that's what it was called, and it's important to know about it. And this is like kind of the first big named military border operation, and it leads to total of over the course of 1953 and 54 the capturing and deportation of 1,965,000 approximately people, 865,000 of whom were deported in 1953 and 1.1 million of whom were deported in 1954. So we see in 1953 alone, we had almost twice the number of people who were deported in the 8 years between 1929 and 37. And yes, the population grew in this time, right? This is sort of around the baby boom, but still, 8 years versus 1 year of deportations is quite a lot of an uptick in the deportation rate. So this is also peak McCarthy era. McCarthy was a congressman who was incredibly concerned with rooting out communism and saw communism as like the ultimate threat to America existing. In the 1950s, he was very, very popular, and he was like a big part of popularizing anti-communist rhetoric and also blacklisting people for being perceived communists and also calling people communists so they would get blacklisted from jobs, from academia, from the media. And communism becomes this really useful tool politically for getting people to turn against somebody. If you call them a communist, people will be like, oh no, America, we hate communists. We hate this person. So communism becomes this useful tool in encouraging anti-migrant sentiments. And so we start to see newspapers calling Mexican migrants things like communist spies. And again, this massive uptick in this illegal alien rhetoric. This continues to escalate until in 1956, the government combines this continuing crackdown with one sort of final expansion of the Bracero program. Because the concern is these quote unquote illegal aliens, right? So the government's like, well, we'll massively crack down on undocumented migration and deport a bunch of people, but we'll also expand the Bracero program so there are a lot more visas being offered. So people have more legal pathways to migrate, even if a lot of those visas are temporary under the Bracero program. So we get a simultaneous downturn in undocumented migration and an uptick in approved migration. So, sorry, my dog's barking. So we get, way more documented migrants, way fewer undocumented migrants. And this change is reflected by Border Patrol apprehension and deportation numbers. By 1959, only 30,000 people get deported versus 1.1 million people in 1954. That's still a lot of people, but it's way fewer than 1.1 million. And so with this shift in dynamics, the border kind of quietly recedes into the background of the U.S. consciousness. And it's not really seen as much as a threat to racial hierarchies, economic status, or the political status quo anymore, for the time being. Then in 1965, the Bracero program ends because Congress is like, in the civil rights period, Congress is like, wait a second, this is really exploitative. We're calling people arms and exploiting them for farm labor. And so they end the program. And they also end the quota system and regional bans on migration and pivot to a sort of like maximum numbers of visas per hemisphere per year. And this expands in 1976 to being like capped per country. So every country can have up to 20,000 visas, first come, first serve, up to this maximum number of visas per hemisphere, and then there's a global maximum as well per year. And these are the first sort of like numerical restrictions on how many applications would be approved for visas from a particular hemisphere or country that affected the Western Hemisphere directly. Because even though there was like a maximum number of Bracero program visas, that's not the same as like the total number of visas that could be approved per year. There was no upper limit for that. But now, Rocky, can you please calm down? Sorry, I don't know if you can hear it, but he's like going crazy downstairs. I think he hears a deer. Rocky. Good boy. So where was I? Yes. So now, instead of these 500 kind of like guaranteed visas that people are getting under the Bracero program, because we need workers to fill those visas, some of which are temporary, some of which are permanent, right? Now there's only 20,000 permanent maximum and no temporary visas. That being said, changing the number of visas that you're going to, like the maximum number of visas you're going to approve, does not change the fact that for quite a while now, both social and economic systems on both sides of the border have kind of come to depend on this flow of workers in the Bracero program. So the economy relies on the farm workers. The economy in Mexico relies on the salaries. And there's sort of become a social world created around this process of men migrating on a seasonal basis to do this labor. So the migration continues just under the table. So now we see, again, because of shifts in policy and labor and in the economy, we see this rising number of undocumented migration. Like that becomes much more common again. And this drop in documented migration because there's a literal cap on how many visas will be approved. So with the rising number of undocumented migrants, we see more public discourse framing undocumented migration as a threat again. And it's the same kinds of rhetoric that we saw under McCarthy, minus the communism allegations, because that's not so much of a thing in the 70s. And not as much. And then we sort of see that same rhetoric being used today, right? This fear of illegal aliens being criminals, right? The criminal assignation comes from the racist stereotyping, and then the idea of an economic threat, like they're taking jobs, and these fears kind of combining this fear of the illegal alien. It's the same rhetoric that we see today. So in the 70s and 80s, border patrol apprehensions and deportations continue to multiply. Rookie, can you please stop barking? I'm trying to teach. And then in 1985, Ronald Reagan stokes the fire by calling undocumented migrants a threat to national security. This rhetoric continues to be politically expedient because of the popularity of media blaming economic disenfranchisement and other social ills like the popularity of drugs during the war on drugs or the prevalence of gang violence on Mexican migrants. And this again comes from those same racist stereotypes. So then there's basically this escalation of this narrative that the border is a site of crisis. And talking about the border as a crisis gets people more and more panicked about the perceived border crisis, which that panic leads to the government spending more money on the border crisis and militarizing the border more, which means more officers patrolling the border, which means more people there to catch people migrating without documents, which then ups the deportation and apprehension numbers, which reaffirms the fears of people panicking about the border crisis, which reaffirms people talking about the border as a crisis. It becomes a feedback loop. And this feedback loop leads to a bunch of policies, like the Immigration Reform and Control Act, which further increased militarization of the border and more funding for that border militarization and policing. And then we get like a series of localized operations in popular border crossings aimed at catching a lot of people and stopping undocumented migration. And then in 1994, we get this introduction of a new policy called prevention through deterrence, which is a really hard thing to talk about because on paper, the argument is oh, Rocky, thank you for coming upstairs. Thank you for quieting down. Say hi, Rocky. Say hi, Rocky. Good boy. So prevention through deterrence. On paper, it's what it sounds like. Trying to prevent undocumented migration by deterring people, by making it harder to succeed. In practice, what this involved was increasing the militarization specifically of popular and safe sites for crossing the border, right? Because the border is quite a long distance, right? And the majority of it goes through very remote stretches of desert, which are extremely dry and arid and hot. Only a limited amount of border crossings are actually relatively safe, or were, right? Those that go through towns and cities, those that go near water, or through areas with trees and like forest cover, so you're not just in the heat exposed. But the vast majority of the border crosses dry desert. And a lot of it is very, very remote. So what that means is people end up walking for miles and miles and miles with no sources of water or shelter from the elements. And so what this means is the prevention through deterrence policy basically makes it impossible or nearly impossible to succeed crossing in the places where people had been doing the majority of their crossing because they were safe places to cross. Now you'll get caught there because there's quite a lot of surveillance there and fences, and now there are walls. But so that what this does is, on the argument is that it's going to deter people from trying. Realistically, people who are crossing the border are often crossing the border because they need to, right? Either they cannot find work or they cannot find work that pays enough to live on. And so their one choice to like feed their families is to cross the border. They're constrained in their options, like Lauren Olamina, for instance. This is not a choice that is made freely and not under duress, right? It's a choice under duress. And then a lot of people are also migrating because their lives are in danger, because of gang violence or because of cartel violence, especially these days. A lot of people are migrating because they think they're going to die if they don't, or they know they will because their lives have been threatened. And so people are not deterred by this policy, and the government knows this. There's quite a lot of data on this point, but the policy is still in place. And that's because it's not actually aimed at preventing migration or deterring people. It's just aimed at upping the stakes a lot. And if you want to read, there's like a very thorough argument for the case that the policy is not actually aimed at deterring people or preventing migration. It's aimed at upping the stakes so much that people will risk everything to cross one time and then risk everything to stay, so that they're easier to control and exploit economically and politically. This is an argument made by Jason De Leon in the book Land of Open Graves. I highly recommend it. It's a really well-written book. It's got a lot of data and a lot of detail on this. So if this is something that interests you and you want to learn more, it's a great place to start. And so, yeah, between 1998 and 2019, at least 7,800 people died of exposure, dehydration, and other causes out in the remote desert because of this policy. And we know it was because of this policy because these areas of the border are so remote that there's really no other reason for people to be out there except desperately crossing the border. So one thing that people have done in response to this policy is try and stop the number of deaths. And this is something that volunteers try to do. One of the most famous groups doing this is something called No Mas Muertes, which is an organization that drives out into the desert looking for people who've died. And they do two things. One thing they do is they map where people have died, because this kind of information tells us a lot about how this policy is being deployed, where people are currently taking routes, where people are being facing these life or death situations, and also where people might need resources and help. And then the other thing they do with that information is they go out and they leave memorials for the people who've died. So they'll put up little white crosses in the desert at the sites where people have died to honor their humanity. And then the other thing they do is they leave caches of resources at the sites where people have died in the hopes that, because they know people are coming through that area because somebody died there. And they also know that people who are coming through that area are facing life or death threats because people have died there. So they hope that the next time somebody comes that way, they won't die because there's water or maybe some first aid supplies, things like that. So they leave supplies and especially clean, safe drinking water in the desert for people to find. So then in 2001, we have 9/11 and the sort of start of the war on terror and the passage of the Patriot Act, which escalates the amount of surveillance and security policies used to protect national security, right? There's a lot more funding and militarization of borders, a lot more suspicion and attention being paid on who's coming in and out of the country, when, where, and why, and from where. And this escalates and eventually leads to the creation of ICE as part of a broader, like, national security escalation. And there's also like a lot more funding to DHS in general, right? Department of Homeland Security. But before we get into more recent events, we should talk about the border as a phenomenon, and that's going to be the subject of our next lecture. So I'll leave it there for now, and I'll see you in the next one.